played football and wrestling and did all of those things that baby boomers did in the 50s and 60s. Now, my parents, who obviously grew up during the Depression, lived in a rural sort of farming community in north central Ohio. They eventually, my mother joined the Navy, my father joined the Air Corps, and they went off to World War II. And when they got back, they met up again, they got married, and they decided, which is very fortunate for me, aside from having children, they decided that they would move to the metropolis of Cleveland, which was up in the north. My father had been a high school football star, a great athlete, and so my parents took advantage of this. Now, this Cleveland, everybody thinks of as the mistake on the lake where the river caught on fire. But actually, it was an extraordinarily cultural community. It had, and I believe still has to this day, one of the world's greatest symphony orchestras. It has, and I know still has today, the oldest professional regional theater in America, the Cleveland Playhouse. It had the magnificent Hanna Theater, where Broadway plays would go on tour. And it also had, not too far from where we lived, a summer professional music theater, not unlike the Melody Tent or Melody Top, with the place in Hyannis. It was a good bit bigger than that, and they didn't just bring in plays, they produced them with Broadway singers and dancers and actors and so forth. And my parents at one point took me, for my birthday I remember, to see a production there at that theater. Now, I'd been to the theater before because as kids we would take field trips to the Cleveland Playhouse. I remember seeing A Midsummer Night's Dream there when I was quite young. We also took trips to the Symphony because I remember going there and experiencing Peter and the Wolf for the first time. But this was when I was, sort of starting high school, and they took me to see, I remember every moment of it, of this professional production of The Sound of Music. And I was dazzled by it. Not just, the musical, just the whole idea of what it was about and how music and storytelling came together and created that amazing evening for me. So the following year, as I was going into my junior year, I decided not to, I opted out of playing football, which was not a great disappointment for the coaching staff, I'm sure. Although it certainly was for my father, and that was a little bit hard for me to do. Instead, I tried out for the school's production, the first time they'd ever done a musical, of Oklahoma. And I was cast as Will Parker, and I sang that song. And I gather it was pretty good. Of course, every high school play is pretty good, and everybody loves it. But the important thing about that was that after the opening night, my father and mother came to see me in the lobby, and my father came right up to me, and he put his hands on my shoulders, and he said, "I wouldn't be as proud of you as I am tonight if you had scored 10 touchdowns." And that set my path. I had the passion now to go into this extraordinary thing, but more importantly, I had the blessing of my parents and the inspiration of them to go ahead and to do that. So the following summer, the Oklahoma that we did was staged by the drama teacher's roommate, who was also the stage manager of this professional Broadway summer theater. So she arranged for me to have an apprenticeship at that theater that I had been taken to. And so I watched and I participated as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old in rehearsals and performances of this extraordinary 6 productions, this extraordinary company of top-notch professional actors. It was, obviously life-changing, and one of the greatest ways I could start out. 2 years later, I went to college at a small little Methodist liberal arts school in Michigan. And among other courses that we had to take that year was, that we required, was a course called Survey of the Bible, which is really history and philosophy put together, but it was based on studying it through through the Bible. So I felt a little bit like I had a step up because I had spent that whole year working on that God and Country Award. And I decided that along with that, I would take what they offered, which was an introduction to the theater. Now, I'd worked in this musical theater world as a kid and knew a lot about that, but I also knew that the theater was much, much, much broader than just these musicals. So I started to study Introduction to the Theater. And that's where I not suddenly, but I gradually began to realize that my study of the Bible, of religions around the world, and my study of theater, that they overlapped. They didn't just overlap, they came together. Because they're both about storytelling with the purpose of inspiring, of teaching, of entertaining, and perhaps, as Shakespeare says to the character of Hamlet, as holding the mirror up to nature. So everything became, in a way, much more profound for me on this path that I felt I was starting out on. I traveled that. I made a life's journey out of all of that. The magic of the theater, the miracles of the theater. And if you study the Bible, if you study any form of religion, there's miracles that occur. Well, the same thing is true, I know, of being in the theater. I'd like to, and it's been around a long time, we like to say we're the second oldest profession in mankind. And I can assure you that sometimes when you're in the midst of it, you feel like you're in the first oldest profession. So my career, it was 50 years or more. It's still going on, because of the Shakespeare Festival. But it was almost exclusively in the theater. When I say theater, I mean the acting profession that goes into film and television and so forth and so on. As an actor, as a director, as a producer, and eventually as an educator, with a very brief stint in television in 1970 when I worked at 30 Rock and worked on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson as a page, but it was still interesting. Now, among other plays that that little theater department did when I was in college, they produced Henrik Ibsen's Hedda Gabler. And that first year, that introduced me to who has really been, over the years, I think my favorite playwright. You have to put Shakespeare in its own place. But after that, Ibsen to me is one of the most powerful playwrights that we've had. In his play Hedda Gabler, of course, what he's dealing with is a woman, and it's not just Hedda Gabler, he does it with A Doll's House magnificently, how women, the problems that women face, this is 19th century Norway, but it's true almost everywhere, at least in Western civilization, the problems that women face in a society that was built and maintained by men. And he did an extraordinary job of illuminating that. I began to see very clearly, although I kind of knew it, but Ibsen made it even stronger, that the theater is, as is written above the proscenium arch in the State Theater of Denmark, in Copenhagen, in Danish, not only for amusement. And that's so true, isn't it? Ibsen still remains a great influence on all playwrights in the theater. In his play, Hedda Gabler, of course, she struggles with the fact that she isn't given the opportunity to be who she really is, a very strong individual. And she can't deal with it, so at the end she takes one of her father's revolvers and she shoots herself off stage. And to which the local judge says, "People don't do such things." One of my favorite lines, people don't do such things. In A Doll's House with Nora, she's also treated that way. She's really saved her husband from collapse, financial collapse, but she's still treated that way. And she's in this doll's house that he builds for her with the children, and she just can't take it. So Ibsen has her at the end of the play. She doesn't shoot herself, but she walks out and she slams the door. And it's quite clear that the slamming, people have said this before, the slamming of that door resonated around the world when Nora did that. Now that's a play that, I don't know whether it's still running, but it's been running on Broadway this season, and the leading lady was nominated for a Tony Award just a few weeks ago. So it still works, and it's done over and over again. Another of his plays that really grabbed me was his play of Ghosts, which is a very vivid commentary about morality in the 19th century. A play, I think, that should be visited again. And then, following that, was still to this day my all-time favorite play, An Enemy of the People, which is about speaking the truth to overcome corruption. Now, this play is going to open this year on Broadway. And if any of you ever had the chance of watching that series Succession, which was really about, I think, the Murdochs and all of those people, the guy that played the oldest son, Jeremy Strong, is going to play in An Enemy of the People. I don't know which part he's going to play. I was talking to Phil, I said, he's either going to be the bad guy and stick with what he did on Succession, or he's going to be the good guy so he can upgrade his resume. But it's coming back. I've never understood why they haven't made a significant movie out of An Enemy of the People. It's a play about a little town in Norway that's a resort town where people go in the summer because there are springs, waters, and they take the waters for their health. And so the town really lives on summer people. And, and the doctor, who everybody obviously admires because he's the only doctor around, he discovers, and he thinks, I think he's right, he makes this incredible discovery that those waters are actually being poisoned by a tanning thing up in the mountains where they, deal with skins and all of that. And it's going down and it's poisoning the waters. So he makes this great discovery. And his brother, who is the mayor, realizes that that great discovery that his brother has made could destroy the town. Because if the word gets out, nobody will come. And so his brother turns him into an enemy of the people. It still, to me, is one of the most powerful plays that I know. I've done it a number of times, and I've done it here at Monomoy. And one year, I put it on the schedule. I had done it before here, but to do in a summer. And the spring preceding that summer, there was, I read it in the Cape Cod Chronicle, there was a controversy because the water pipe system in Chatham, somebody discovered that the lining of the pipes, there was something wrong with them, and they could potentially poison people. So that summer, we had the play going, and I was out in front of the theater, and this man came up to me and he said, "I know why you're doing that play." He said, "You're doing that because of what happened with the water pipe." And I said, "Well, thank you, but actually I picked this play last fall, long before they made that discovery." And he looked at me and he said, "Then are you the guy that poisoned the pipes?" And, anyway, but speaking of a guy, and one of the things about the Monomoy Theater to me, I went there, after I did my stint at NBC, I decided I really wanted to focus in on the craft of acting more than I did in my liberal arts school. So I looked around and I found an extraordinary teacher, one of the great teachers of acting, named Bob Hobbs, and he was at Ohio University, which had nothing to do with my having grown up in Ohio. There were two different worlds, because Ohio University was down in Appalachia. But I auditioned for that, and I got in. And it was wonderful, but they also had, which most of you probably do know, they had a summer theater on Cape Cod. John Baker had been the president of Ohio University, and he and his wife Elizabeth had a house. It's that yellow house, on Bridge Street. And she was very active when in the theater in Ohio in the summer, but she said it was too hot. And the Monomoy Theater, when Mary Winslow sold it, had a sign out, and she went up there and she wanted to buy it. So she went to the theater department as the president's wife and said, "Don't you think we should continue our summer theater, but someplace near the water?" And they said, "Sure," because they thought she meant Lake Erie. Anyway, that's how the Monomoy Theater came about. And I was asked to come and be in the company, and I said, because I was married at the time to Jan, and I said, "Is there any way my wife could come along?" And they said, "Well, she could help Mrs. Lane in the gardens." And I said, "She'd love that," because she was a biology teacher. So she did, and they fell more in love with her than me, so I got to go back a second year, I think because of her. But the thing that amazed me in that first season of 8 plays, we would do 8 plays. One of them was Neil Simon's, not Barefoot in the Park, Come Blow Your Horn. It's a delightful little comedy. And the one preceding that was T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, this enormous verse about that, Thomas Becket and all that. And I thought, whoa, that's going to be interesting. Well, Murder in the Cathedral that summer sold out before it ever opened. And Come Blow Your Horn did well, but it didn't do as well. And I thought there's something special going on in this little town, isn't there? And so I continued. Later on, as you said, I did do a lot of work overseas. I'll talk a little bit about that. But I always got a kick out of being able to say to groups that I worked with, other directors and actors, and that I was convinced I was the only producer, probably in the world, that did Meredith Willson's The Music Man one week and Ibsen's Ghost the next. And they both sold out. That's Chatham. Okay, Ibsen, my hero. And I think a hero to everyone that likes what the theater's about. But Shakespeare, of course, really has to be considered undoubtedly the greatest playwright the theater's ever known. And it continues to hold that distinction. He does. His 37 plays continue over more than 500 years after his death to be presented all the time. And when the Monomoy Theater was sold, I think it was 5 years ago, and then we also had the pandemic, so things were quiet. But people asked, when can you reopen? And I said, I can't reopen. I have nothing to do with it. It's a property developer. I have nothing to do with it at all. But I realized that there was an interest, and so I talked to some friends and got this idea, and Bernard and I sort of came up with this. I said to him, do you think this is a good idea? And he said, go for it. So of having a Cape Cod Shakespeare Festival, which we started last year with Twelfth Night and A Midsummer Night's Dream. We had no idea what would happen. It has to be free to the public because anything at Kate Gould Park is required to be free, according to Kate Gould when she gave the property. So we solicited funds from corporations and foundations and individuals, and enough came in that we were able to do it, and it did go well. We did Monday through Thursday and then Saturday, so it's really 5 nights a week. Clearly not on Friday because that's the world famous fan concerts, which are wonderful. And I talked to a friend, Cara Odell, and she created a set and all of that. And many of you have probably been there. If you haven't, you're welcome to come. But it was very successful, and we're doing it again. And we're doing it this year with Much Ado About Nothing. And then As You Like It. Now, there's always controversy as to who wrote Shakespeare's plays. I actually had a Cape Cod Shakespeare Festival hat on the other day when I was sitting waiting for some friends in Provincetown, and a lady came up and asked me about it. And then she said, what do you think about this theory about the Oxfordians and who really wrote Shakespeare? And I said, I think it's silly and unimportant. There are 37 plays that are magnificent, and it has his name on it. Why does it matter?
This next one?
She sort of walked away. Because I do feel that way. And I've heard this story before, but there was a little production of Hamlet being done somewhere out in the country, in a town, small town. And the reviewer the next day talked about that controversy. And he wrote this long article about who really did Shakespeare. Was it the Oxfordians? And at the end he said, we've never known until now, because if you dig all of those people up, the one that rolled over last night wrote Hamlet. Where did Shakespeare get his ideas? Well, that's a whole course of study. But he did borrow from the Bible. Because in As You Like It, old Adam says to Orlando, he that doth the ravens feed, yet providently caters to the sparrow, be comfort to my age. And in the Bible, in the book of Luke, chapter 12, verses 6 and 7, it says, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings, and not one of them is forgotten before God? Fear not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows. Well, the year after 9/11, which obviously we all can, have our own stories about that, but I thought we need to do something that summer, a special performance, and I think we need to celebrate, as everybody was, America by celebrating the American theater. So I thought we'll put together a group, we'll get some alumni to come in, we'll use the company, and we'll create a program that celebrates America. And my dear, wonderful friend, who was the president of the Friends of the Monomoy at that time, Betty Clemens, said to me, well, if you're going to do that, why don't you make it about one of the greatest actresses that the American theater has ever known, who happens to live in Chatham, Miss Julie Harris. Brilliant. So I talked to Julie, and she's been, okay. Now, Julie, it's important to know that a couple of years before that, she was doing a play in Chicago, and she suffered a stroke. She was all right, but she got aphasia, so she knew what she wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come out, which put pretty much an end to this unbelievable career. So what we decided we would do, I said, we can't do scenes from the Belle of Amherst in front of the Belle of Amherst. That would be difficult. So what we decided to do, she won 5 Tony Awards, a 6th for a Lifetime Achievement. And what we decided to do was to pick plays from the seasons in which she won those awards and do scenes and songs from those. And I got wonderful Anne LeClaire, my dear friend from the beginning of being at Monomoy, and asked if she would write a script about it, and she did. And it was grand. It was one of the great nights in the theater for me. But I said the theater, like the church, has its miracles. And at the end of the evening, right before the big finale, my closest friend and colleague, who we unfortunately lost this year, Michael John McGann, who was in it, of course, went out, and he told the story of what was Julie's really the thing that broke her into her career, which was a member of The Wedding, when she played young Frankie, a little sort of tomboy. And in that play, she has a scene with the housekeeper, Bernice, who was played by the amazing Ethel Waters. And she says, I'm going to change my name, this little kid. And Bernice says, you can't change your name. She says, why? And she says, because things accumulate around your name. You can't just wipe that out. And then Ethel Waters sings to Frankie. This is going back to Luke, in a way. His eye is on the sparrow. And Michael John sang it in his unbelievable Irish tenor voice. And we were standing in the wings and trying to keep from crying. And suddenly we heard this noise. And it was coming from out in the audience. And I thought, what is that? It's somebody singing. And I sort of stuck my head out, and in the front row was Julie Harris singing clearly every word of that song. That's a miracle. And one of the great moments in the theater for me. Like you said, I did do a lot of work when I was at the dean at North Carolina School of the Arts. I was asked to join the International Theater Conference, International Theater Institute, which is a branch off of the UN. And we did. We traveled. The first place we went was to Istanbul and then to the Soviet Union. This was all during the late 80s and into the 90s, so that the Iron Curtain was still kind of waving there. And we would meet and talk about what the theater meant in our country and to mankind and so forth and so on. It was an extraordinary experience. And at the same time, I had, with a friend of mine, helped develop, along with a group of other people, something called the World Theater Training Institute, which was 12 countries that most of them had state theaters. Obviously, ours doesn't, but others do. And those state theaters also had conservatories. So we would get together at various places around the world, and all these students would come from different countries and put on plays and share ideas. And it was really, it was a wonderful thing. I don't know that it still exists, but I hope some form of it does, because the theater speaks beyond language, and it's so profound. But one of the things that I remember the most was being in Budapest and going to what is called the Josef Katanov Theater and seeing a production of Three Sisters which was in Hungarian, but I knew the play so well, it didn't matter. And I had never to this day experienced acting on that level, that performance level. It was unbelievable. Now you have to keep in mind that there's a state theater, or there was at that time in Budapest, just as there was in Russia and Czechoslovakia and so forth. So they got to rehearse probably for 9 months, and they kept it in their repertoire for about 12 years. So they really knew it well, but it was unbelievable. But even more so than that was this theater that held 500, maybe 600 people, was almost all 20-year-old, 20-some people in their mid-20s, watching a 3-hour, some of them standing, a 3-hour production of Anton Chekhov, another great playwright, obviously, Russian, his 3 sisters. So afterwards, we had dinner with the artistic director of the theater, and I said, this is one of the greatest things I've ever seen, but I have to tell you, I don't know how you got all those young people in to see this play. If you did this play on Broadway, you would never get that, unless it was a rock opera or, you know, Hamilton now or something like that. But getting 500 people to go into a Broadway theater, 500 20-year-olds to see 3 sisters or any Chekhov or whatever, would be unheard of. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, well, I have to tell you, my friend, the reason those young people are here is because in my country, they know the theater is the only place they can go to hear the truth. Unbelievable. And I think it's true. So anyway, that's that brought me up to there. Now, I'm talking about Norwegians and Russians and all of that, but we have our own as well, our own contributors to this extraordinary art form that goes back so far and says so much. Arthur Miller, an enemy, Death of a Salesman, The Crucible, on and on and on, Tennessee Williams, Eugene O'Neill, Neil Simon. Neil Simon is a brilliant playwright and probably America's Chekhov. You also have playwrights that dealt with specific issues and audiences, like August Wilson, dealing with African Americans, Lorraine Hansberry, going back to there, Tony Kushner, dealing with basically what is homophobia. And the playwrights continue to support and to illustrate the human experience through the theater. But I think, without a doubt, the greatest contribution to the world of theater that our country has made was adding the powerful emotion of music to the storytelling. Now, there's opera and there's operetta and all of that, but the actual musical theater, it's ours. We own it. I used to have music theater kids say, why do the acting trainers get to go to England and we don't? And I said, because the World Center for Musical Theater is a 2-hour drive from here. We own it. We let the British borrow it a little, and they've done all right, but it's ours. And it deals with so much. When I said I spent those 2 summers in that musical theater, the first play that I worked on there was Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein's magnificent story of Edna Ferber's sprawling a saga which deals with racism, of Showboat. Blew me away. Again, A Raisin in the Sun. Lillian Hellman, all the way back there, A Children's Hour, dealing with what we now call homophobia. And even though he's not American, right now we've got Tony Kushner's magnificent play, Leopoldstad, which is dealing again with the ultimate in anti-Semitism. Kander and Ebb's Cabaret, a magnificent classical play dealing with anti-Semitism. And Leopoldstad won the Tony Award for Best Play, and the Tony Award for Best Revival of a Play went to Parade, which is another unbelievably powerful musical play about anti-Semitism. You have Falsettos, again, about homophobia, and there's all kinds of plays that still deal with racism. These 3 things alone, the theater takes on and will continue to do so, I'm sure, forever and ever, through revivals and through new plays that new young writers will talk about. And those three things in particular are really raising their ugly heads. Racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia today. And it's depressing, it's shocking, and we have to continue to fight it. And one of the best ways to do so, I think, is with the theater and all branches of the theater, film, television, and so forth. One of, without a doubt, the most powerful songs, I think, about, it's sort of specifically about racism, but it's really about hatred, is in, I'm using them a lot, but it's in Rodgers and Hammerstein's play based on Michener's Tales of the South Pacific. It's in South Pacific. And I'm very happy to say that I have with us today, coming down from Eastham, Henry Silverstein, who will be in the Shakespeare Company this summer, and he'll be singing, he'll be playing his guitar and acting. And he is going to come up. He just graduated from University of Minnesota in their Guthrie Theater music theater program, and was very kind to come here today, just to give you a moment of that wonderful song from South Pacific.
You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, of people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you turn 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught.
Now, obviously, I know that the theater and all those wonderful forms of religion are not just about telling us what's wrong with our lives and how to improve them. They're also about celebrating our lives and the love of being alive. And I think that is actually, well, it's done in many ways in the theater, but I think one of the most powerful ways is, again, in Rodgers and Hammerstein's masterpiece, their anthem of Carousel. And I have another person that's going to be with us this summer singing, Sadie O'Connor, who lives in Centerville, and she's just in the midst of finishing up her graduate degree at the Indiana University, the amazing School of Music there, and she's come to sing that anthem for us today. So, Sadie. What more can I say? Nothing, except that I think you want to get your blankets and your folding chairs down to the park early this summer to hear these people and the rest of the company. I would like to take just one moment to ask you if you will be willing to represent for me the thousands of audience members I've had the honor and the privilege to work for in my career, and to say to you, thank you. Thank you for making this, as Frank Capra said, a wonderful life. See you in the park.